Back here on the show, and we're getting more into the New York Giants in today's segment, in the second segment of today's show, just because I thought this was pretty interesting and a pretty unique situation with Darius Slayton in regards to his quarterback Daniel Jones, and I'll explain more on that after I give a bit of context with you guys on this situation, right? If you haven't been keeping up with the preseason, the first start for Daniel Jones in 2024 in preseason didn't go so great. Obviously, he threw a couple interceptions. He threw that pick six on a very bad decision that he made, throwing it across his body, sort of going to the ground and just throwing a gimme to the Houston Texans safety Jalen Petrie. But regardless of that, you can sort of cut him some slack just because he has been coming back from that ACL injury, and that was his full, game-like environment that he was coming back to. But you can't cut him too much, obviously, because Daniel Jones, this is sort of starting to become a habit, a bad one, obviously, with the decision making that he has. It's not so much putting it in bad spots or anything like that. It's just seeing that the throw is pretty much dead, but you're still going to throw it anyway. And not to mention, you have a defensive lineman dragging you down from your other side. You're still going to throw it. It's those sort of things that get this level of criticism, right? He got killed that whole next few days on whether or not the Giants made a mistake keeping him, and all that sort of stuff came back up again, right? And then what was kind of funny was that the Jets and the Giants had a joint practice the next few days, and the Jets just completely dominating the Giants on both sides of the ball. I'm sure you guys saw some of the clips. Garrett Wilson having a great practice, Aaron Rodgers as well. The defense as well, having success against the Giants offense. And they asked Sauce Gardner on one of these practices, one of the media availabilities after one of the practices, and they simply just asked them about Daniel Jones. And, he sort of stuttered, had a couple just pauses in what he was going to say, really thinking about not getting himself in trouble. And all he said was that Daniel Jones was a good quarterback. And, that kind of picked up some steam, and everybody ran with the joke, obviously, knowing that he didn't want to say anything that would get him in trouble, which was pretty funny the way he handled it. But now, with that carrying on over the next few days, it got to Darius Slayton, and he sort of gave his opinion on all the people poking fun of Daniel Jones and this negative narrative around Daniel Jones recently, and his thoughts on it. Basically, one of the first things he said, one of the first statements that he made was that it's easy to say negative things once there's a negative narrative around a person, but it doesn't always make it, well, in this case, it doesn't make it true, nor does he, Sauce Gardner, see him on a day-in, day-out basis. And that was one of the opening things he said, and it is true, obviously. As the wide receiver to Daniel Jones, you're not going to go out there and also bash him. You're going to come to the defense of your quarterback, and he is right. Sauce isn't with him day in and day out. For him and for other people to just jump on this sort of running joke with Daniel Jones and just poke fun at the fact that some people might not just think he's very good. And while that might be some people's opinion, having this statement now by Darius Slayton and saying that it's easier to jump on a person like that and just join in on the joke and just think that that's correct. Yes and no. I kind of see what he's saying, but it's always going to be harder, especially when you're an athlete, a quarterback even, and people are running with this joke. It's always going to be hard to come to the defense of somebody, especially like Daniel Jones, and I don't mean that in any sort of negative way, but it is just based on the context of that player, right? Because if you think of another quarterback that has a very diverse opinion around him in the media or around the NFL, you look at a guy like Josh Allen or something like that, right? You have a lot of people saying that he's a top 2, top 3 quarterback. I personally think that he is one of the top guys, but then you have other people, again, peers or media members saying that he just doesn't do it for them. He throws too many turnovers and that he could be overrated to some people. And it's easier in that sense to come to the defense of Josh Allen because he has done extraordinary things on the football field. He wins games for his teams. But with Daniel Jones, the context matters in a way where it's harder to come to the defense of Daniel Jones if you're a fan, if you're a media member, because he makes it so hard for anybody to come to his defense, and that has to do a lot with it. And everybody running with this negative narrative, it's hard to defend Daniel Jones when he doesn't really give you too much to defend him with, right? If that makes sense. So I kind of see what he was saying there. Darius Slayton, he's not going to bash his own quarterback, but there is some more background checks or more information you have to really dig into to kind of understand this whole situation with Daniel Jones. And not only that, but he didn't stop there. Darius Slayton went in a little bit more on why the Giants, maybe Daniel Jones as being the quarterback of the Giants in such a major market, gets more criticism than some other guys. And he had no problem just name dropping a bunch of them. In this statement, he said, I think because we play in primetime a lot, we're media covered a lot, we're the Giants. If we were the Jags, you don't hear anybody say anything about Trevor Lawrence or Justin Herbert for that matter. Matter of fact, if you ask most people about Justin Herbert, they'd probably tell you that he's a top 5 quarterback, but under what logic? And he says that people just usually gravitate towards the size, the big arm of some of these quarterbacks, and people don't really take into account the processing part of it all. And you don't really see receivers or anybody coming to the defense of their quarterback. That's typical, but to name drop Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert, and say in a way alluding to the fact that they don't deserve almost to be held to a higher standard than Daniel Jones, because one, they play in a lesser market in Jacksonville and in Los Angeles, the market around the Chargers especially, but just based on playing and the production, it's hard to disagree with Darius Slayton a little bit, because I brought it up on here before, right? We've talked about Trevor Lawrence and some of the skepticism that I have with him. Not so much that I would hold him to the same regard as Daniel Jones. I think that's where Darius Slayton loses me a little bit. But in terms of, we've talked about it, getting that $55 million contract. Yes, it's the market, and it is how the market, controls a lot of these contract extensions that happen. But I was still a little hesitant just because you look at what Trevor's done and you look at who's making that type of money. To me, the only one that has deserved that sort of contract is Joe Burrow. He's gone out there, beaten Patrick Mahomes, gone to a Super Bowl, just been a serial winner throughout his time in the NFL, whereas Trevor Lawrence, bad year with Urban Meyer, came back, got better, especially under Doug Peterson, but still they had that debacle a year or two ago or I think it was just last year actually, where they just collapsed towards the end of the year, missed the playoffs, and Trevor, much like the rest of the offense, it's not just on him, but didn't play very well. And once you do get into the playoffs, that one year that they did make it, they had that great comeback, funny enough, against Justin Herbert, so that doesn't paint him in any better of a light than it does with a guy like Daniel Jones. He had that playoff comeback, then he ended up losing to the Chiefs, I want to say, so a very limited amount of success to really think that, Trevor or Justin are miles ahead of Daniel Jones, where you look at some of the comparisons just between all three of those guys specifically. You look at Justin Herbert, 0-1 in the playoffs. Daniel Jones is 1-1 in the playoffs, the same thing as Trevor Lawrence. And one of the things that I saw circulating a lot over this time with Daniel Jones and everybody talking about whether or not the Giants made a mistake in keeping him was that through his first 48 starts, all those stats, the touchdowns, the completion percentage, the interceptions, and things like that, were very similar to the first 48 career starts that Trevor Lawrence had in terms of their stats and how they compared through their first 48 to 50 games or so. Trevor and Daniel Jones were very similar in a lot of those statistics. And to Darius Slayton's point, not a lot of people would compare Trevor Lawrence to Daniel Jones, where through most of their career, or at least the earlier portion of it, they haven't been too distant in terms of what they've produced out there on the field. But it could be the market. I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. In New York, there's a lot more spotlight. There's a lot more just news and people talking about you each and every day. And it is harder. I truly believe it is harder to play in some of these markets like Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, or anything like that. Dallas, I guess, in football. But I think that can only go so far, really, in terms of using it as a reason as to why Daniel Jones just gets more criticism. And yes, maybe Jacksonville, Los Angeles with the Chargers isn't in the same boat, but really, what I just came to a final decision on was that with Trevor and with Justin, their highs, even though they do have some pretty bad moments throughout their career, maybe they haven't taken that next step, but the moments of brilliance, their highs, more so than not, are a lot higher and a lot more beneficial than that of Daniel Jones, right? In the grand scheme of things, yes, it might be a little bit similar when you're talking about playoff record and all-time stats and things like that, stats through their first 4 years. It's similar to Daniel Jones, but really, they're just not showing the same level of highs, like I said, and also the same level of lows. I think Daniel Jones's lows and his mishaps and just mistakes happen a lot more often than that of Trevor and Justin Herbert. And not only that, Justin and Trevor sort of offset it with having some pretty great performances, having game-winning drives, being the reasons why their team wins, and just showing a lot more good than a lot of their bads, right? But with Daniel Jones, you don't really get that same compensation because it's hard with not just him, but obviously the makeup of the team and the lack of offensive line protection and things like that. That all goes into it. But just him, he doesn't produce enough points, touchdowns, or just ability on a week-to-week basis to kind of offset all those negatives that you see, like the fumbles, the interceptions, not being reliable, potentially not, or dealing with injuries or whatnot, things like that. So, and even also just lastly with Trevor and Justin, they've slowly gotten better. I think you've seen them mature a little bit more, gain a little bit more confidence, learn on the go at a lot faster pace. Whereas with Daniel Jones, you thought you were seeing that progression, you thought you were seeing that next step when they made it to the playoffs, but then they had the following season and they just plummeted once again. He was in and out of the lineup getting hurt and, just didn't play well enough compared to 2022. So it's those sort of things that can't fluctuate when you're trying to compare yourself to these other quarterbacks, because while they might have bad moments like you do, it often offsets with the great performances they put on. Whereas with Daniel Jones, that's the big part of it that's lacking, and that's sort of where it is right now with Daniel. Yes, the market is a big factor in relevancy and keeping you in the just regular cycle of news that goes on during the day-to-day news cycle, but it also has a lot to do with Daniel and just thinking about it, not just the grand scheme of things, but the specifics, what he brings to the table, and how consistent he is. The lack of consistency, I should say, is one of the big reasons that it is similar to Trevor and Justin, but if you look a little bit harder, you do see a lot of those differences, and that's why those guys are getting paid as they are. And Daniel, while he got his extension, it's not talked about in the same light as those guys. So that's pretty much all on Darius Slayton. Some pretty interesting comments just because, again, you don't really see guys just flat out call other guys out and alluding to the fact that maybe they're not playing as good as many people think. But, to each his own in his opinion. That's how Darius Slayton feels about it. But we're going to move on to some more topics on today's show that I didn't mention before. We're going to talk about the NFC East a little bit more, talking about a question I thought of. Is it a bigger deal if the Washington Commanders, with all the hype they've built up in the preseason, is it a bigger deal if they finish second, or is it a bigger deal if the Dallas Cowboys finish third and just completely miss the playoffs for the first time in a long time? So we're going to get into that open discussion when we return. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.